5. The trip to Sweden. Is it really you, Timothy? My grandmother's voice was full of laughter and tears. My only grandson, are you alive? Why didn't you ring before? Is it really you, or just someone's idea of an unkind joke? If it's really you, Tim, you should come and visit as soon as possible. I'm on my way, grandmother. We were together 4 years ago, so you'll recognize me when you see me. I'm looking forward to seeing you. Toodle pip, grandmother. Toodle pip was something we had always said when I was small. I said it so she would know it was me for sure. Her happy laugh at the other end confirmed that she understood. When Matthew came, he told me that Nancy had been very inquisitive after I'd left. She wanted to know the whole story. She heard a condensed version, and accepted it readily. I think she has second sight, Matt confessed as we walked into the forest. Like Eleanor, I added, smiling. I'm inclined to believe in Telos and everything that happened there, said Matt, his eyes glinting playfully, until there's proof to the contrary. As far as my wife and daughter are concerned, I've known for a long time that they're both intriguingly different. I believe in the supernatural, and yet I don't believe. Worlds beyond this one must exist. It would be arrogant of us to imagine otherwise. I reached my hand out toward a branch of the lime tree we were passing. To my surprise, not to mention Matt's, the branch came away from the tree and flew into my hand. Matt stopped in his tracks. Are you a wizard as well? He frowned. What happened? What did you do? I'm as flabbergasted as you are, I exclaimed. At the same time, I wondered if Mandel's embrace on Mount Shasta hadn't been more than just a hug. This might be a message from him or the man Eleanor had seen behind me. I smiled and thumped Matt on the back. Do you believe me now? I asked. I'm flying to Sweden first thing tomorrow. I'll take time off and drive you to the airport, replied Matt, unless you're going to teleport. Yes, I reckon you've seen some strange things. Take good care of yourself, and come home soon. When you get back, I think you should buy a car. You have to get on the road and tell people your story. Next morning, sitting on the plane to Sweden, I thought about the reaction of my childhood friend. His last words at the airport had been, I'll be there for you, no matter what. Let me know everything's okay. I knew that he was one of the few who would believe me. A hollow earth was too much for people to get their heads around, and if I was unlucky, there could be an uproar. Yet I was convinced that Emily, my grandmother, would believe me. When the taxi drew up at my grandmother's house in Florida, which I hadn't visited since I was 10, grandmother rushed out with open arms. After a keen glance and a cheerful chuckle, my only living relative on the earth's surface hugged me. Tears ran down her worn cheeks, and she whispered repeatedly, You're alive, you're alive. If only your mother had known. She died of unnecessary grief. But grandmother, you know as well as I do that our journey through life is preordained, I remonstrated as we entered the house arm in arm. I stole a glance at her. Her white hair was elegantly trimmed. Her face was carefully made up. You had to look for wrinkles. She was plumper than I remembered, but not fat like Tilly at home. I felt no surprise entering her beautiful living room and sinking into an antique armchair. Tell me everything, Tim, even if you've spent 3 years in a foreign brothel. You know I'm not easy to shock. She laughed delightedly at her audacity and served me coffee from a thermos jar. I assured her that was not the case, but that I had spent 3 years in another country inside our own earth. At first, she seemed flabbergasted, but then she jumped out of her chair and hugged me. Oh, Tim, how wonderful, she gasped. I've always believed the earth was hollow, ever since I was at school, but everyone assured me it was impossible, as the planet was full of molten lava and fire, just like a volcano. I've never believed the scientists were right on that score. Tell me every single detail you can remember, my dear. I talked and talked. In the end, I was so homesick for Telos that I had tears in my eyes. I reached out and took grandmother's hands. How can I fulfill my mission? I groaned. Nobody is going to believe me, apart from you. And you're not like other people. We'll have to make sure they believe you, grandmother promised me. I know plenty who will. Tomorrow we'll make a start. But now we're going to have a lovely dinner, and in the morning you can sleep in. You've had a long, tiring journey. I'm going to tell you about your mother and sister. Your brother-in-law would never believe you. He's an unpleasant man, and I can't understand why your sister chose him. Now it was grandmother's turn to talk, and I was glad I came as fast as I could. It was nice to know about Mum and little Un. I needed some kind of closure on the part of my life, which was over now. New horizons were opening up, and it was time to make plans to carry out my mission. You know, Tim, grandmother remarked after dinner, as we were lounging in front of the fire which I had helped light. I have never told you everything about myself. I'm a medium and I help people, and actually I have quite a good reputation, which I'm grateful for. I lecture about other worlds, other planets, and cosmic consciousness. I help people find their inner selves, listen to their own hearts, and straighten out their minds. Do you see it in the cards? I interrupted her. No, I see it in their eyes, she answered calmly, smiling. Their eyes tell me what their lips cannot convey. I can see their auras, which is always helpful. Otherwise, I have nocturnal friends, guides, as they're called, who help me. They appear in the daytime too, but I have to be in a trance. I have a spirit guide, you see, who has been with me through various lives. I listen to him and talk to him sometimes. Jesus? I asked. Grandmother smiled wanly. No, she replied. Too many claim to be in contact with Jesus. It's very contemporary to be in contact with Jesus and God. My guide is called Melchizedek. Melchizedek? I interrupted again. You have a great guide in him, an ascended master arisen from the dead. I know, my grandmother resumed calmly, a smile twitching at the corners of her mouth. He's wonderful, and incredibly wise. He was an alchemist, and Abraham's teacher. Now he's my teacher. She chuckled in that special way. Well, my grandson, do you believe me? Yes, I sighed, impressed. Of course I do. Can you also see him? I see him with my inner eye. He's taught me a lot, I have to say. He was a comfort when my family died, and I'm convinced he helped to save you. He didn't dare tell me, though. I would have done all I could to bring you home. In my heart of hearts, I cherished a hope that you were still alive somewhere, washed up on a far-flung shore. I have never understood the trend for ascended masters that many people indulge in, but when my own grandmother professed to having one, I was forced to acknowledge that these high masters may have contact with humanity. I'm not really interested in this kind of thing, and I would rather cultivate the sort of knowledge I came across in Telos. But we'll get to that later, when I tell you about returning there. I had learned to live in the present during my stay in Telos, as the concept of time there is as free as the sweet-smelling air, but now I had to conform to Earth time. Grandmother gave me a diary. It is a necessary piece of equipment on Earth. 6.an Impossible Mission. Grandmother had a number of spiritual contacts, and she was definitely a good connection for this odyssey, as I considered my task. She rang all her acquaintances who had occult interests and invited them to a meeting at her house on Saturday. Many were interested when they heard it was about Hollow Earth. I would tell them about the inner Earth city of Telos. 24 people agreed to come, and on Saturday they crowded into the spacious living room. Grandmother served coffee and cakes, and everyone jostled around me, asking about Telos. I gave a short lecture and answered questions. One man caught my attention. At first he kept in the background, but later he asked if I was planning to stay in Dalarna or if I would be willing to talk about Telos in Stockholm. I jumped at the chance. I realized quite soon that Telos only interested those familiar with parapsychology. The first lecture I gave in Phelan attracted an audience of 7. My new acquaintance, Carl Olive Strand, generally known as Chaos, became a firm friend who dedicated himself to guiding me through the ordeal that is parapsychology. He was divorced, recently retired, and lived in a house just outside Floda. This meant we had ample opportunity to meet. It was difficult to convince some people that there really is a whole world inside the earth. Why had nobody else discovered it before? How could they be sure I was telling the truth and wasn't a spiritual conman? Chaos comforted me when I had doubts about my mission. He had a doctorate and was very intelligent. His presence at my lectures should have brought me credibility. Believing in an inhabited world, Agartha, inside the earth, was too extreme. To some, it seemed like a swindle, and if I didn't cease my ridiculous nonsense, I should be put away, either in a mental institution or a police cell. I was under constant threat, and when the newspapers got wind of it, things got worse. Chaos was my self-appointed bodyguard. He was quite well known, an academic, responsible for many interesting articles, but he was taking a scandalously serious interest in pure science fiction. Grandmother was a constant source of encouragement, and her loving defense of her only grandchild was commendable. She didn't care that I was unpopular with some of her friends and most of the inhabitants of Florida. It was so bad that I bought a dog, a Great Dane, 2 years old, trained to protect. I called him Titch, as he was so huge. We became the best friends in the world, eating and sleeping together. His constant companionship engendered respect and admiration. I bought him from an old lady who could no longer walk him. My grandmother organized it, of course. Soon it was a common sight to see me walking Titch, who reached above my waist. He was gleaming black and inspired respect. Titch still lives in Telos, but I dare not bring him to the earth today, as the time may not be right for him. With their tiny, short skirts, their heavily made-up eyes, and weird hair, none of the girls on earth impressed me. Many of them were beautiful, and, actually, there were some normal ones, but I sensed that they only pretended interest in my subject to go to bed with me. I don't think the earth has bothered to take care of its inhabitants properly, or vice versa, which is preferable. In other words, I didn't fall in love with a girl on the surface, despite being surrounded by them. Grandmother, Chaos, and Titch were the only ones I talked to and who helped me express myself. One evening, as we were sitting in front of the fire as usual, Grandmother inquired, "Timothy, are you planning to stay here and carry on like this? Is this what you envisioned? You've been here 3 months, and you know you can stay here as long as you want, but Swedes basically still don't believe in the existence of Telos. I have approached some contacts in television, and they aren't remotely interested. You don't have any proof to back up your claims. You can prove you were shipwrecked and saved by persons unknown. Your denigrators claim it may have been an unknown tribe in the Canadian mountains. I hear all sorts of things when you are traveling, and it worries me. Swedes always need proof, you know." "Proof," I muttered. "Aren't I proof enough? I can make things move by mere thought, and influence people mentally, if necessary." "People don't want conjuring tricks," said Grandmother impatiently. "The only proof you have of your identity is your passport. We need much more than that, Tim. We need the knowledge and insight to understand. It would be easier to prove that there is life in outer space than inside the planet. I can contact beings in outer space through my guide, Melchizedek, if I want. But I want to sort you out first. You have a mission, and I have promised to help, and that's what I'm going to do." I walked further and further with Titch. I could let him off the lead in the woods and he would stay close. This gave me time to reflect. I thought about the beauty I'd met dancing in Telos with Manal. It cheered me up, thinking of her, of Manal, and the amazing wonderland. At the same time, I felt oppressed by my mission. I decided to call Manal. I needed help. I blew the little whistle, and Manal came. "What's the problem, Tim?" he asked. He appeared to me in the forest, wrapped in a green cloak, merging with the moss and trees. "Wheel." I drew it out. "I don't know if I should stay here or return to Agartha." At this juncture, Titch returned from a run. He stopped in his tracks when he caught sight of Manal. I thought he would start barking, but Manal bent down and patted him on his gleaming doggy neck. Titch pushed his great head against Manal, and lay down on the moss at his side. "You are welcome to bring him to Telos when you come," Manal commented, and that made me want to leave immediately. but Mantle raised his hand. "Really," he remarked, "you had no need to call me. This is your problem alone. It's up to you to choose. I can't give you any advice other than to listen to your heart. You will know. I can't tell you what is right or wrong, you have to choose. Use your common sense and don't get caught up in your emotions." This was a sore point. I always have problems making decisions, as I'm scared of flapping off in the wrong direction. I'm quite impulsive and have to restrain myself sometimes, well, always. "Thanks," I said slowly. "Sorry for calling you unnecessarily, but you've helped me decide." I looked up, but Mantle had gone. Maybe he had been a hologram, limited by time and range. Titch didn't react to Mantle's disappearance. He yelped and dug his nose so hard into my armpit that I almost toppled over. It was his special sign of love, and I laughed and started running homeward. I hadn't bought a car yet, as grandmother had lent me her Audi. Besides, I was going to wait until I got back to Seattle. Home, sweet home, how many homes have I got? I drove the Audi as fast as I could, way over the speed limit, to Juris to see chaos, with Titch panting on the back seat. 7. Tim's new family. I decided to return to Seattle. I may have planted some ideas which would flourish in Swedish minds. I decided to write an article about Telos, and Chaos promised to print it in one of the big daily papers. It was tough leaving grandmother, my only living relative. I promised to ask if she could come to Telos. That's what she wanted now. She was tired of spirituality in Sweden, such as it was so superficial. I was worrying about Titch being caged on the plane and going into quarantine in the US, but then I realized that Mantle could help. I would be returning to Telos soon, anyway. He came, to my relief, and took Titch, who was no problem. Both of them disappeared in a haze. When I reached Seattle and jumped into a taxi, I felt like a stranger. I began wondering if I shouldn't have gone straight back to Telos. But first, I wanted to see my closest friends, Matthew, Nancy, and Eleanor. Nancy may even have had her baby by now. I decided to stay a month in my childhood home, and then it would be time to return inside the earth. I missed the wisdom which pervaded Telos. Neither Swedish nor Canadian learning was enough for me. Not that Seattle was in Canada, but it wasn't far off. I'd always thought of myself as a Canadian, ever since I was a child. Before I went back to my house, I called on Matt and Nancy. I was dying to tell them about Sweden and Titch. We pulled up outside their house, and I asked the taxi not to wait. It wasn't far to walk home from there, and I didn't have much to carry. The lights were on, and I rang the doorbell. It was only 8 o'clock, but it took Nancy a long time to open the door. Her eyes looked red, as if she had been crying, and I couldn't see Eleanor. Nancy was slim, so the baby must have come. Then I heard the terrible news. Matthew was dead. He had been killed in a car accident. He was hit by a drunk driver on his way home from work. His car had spun around, gone into the ditch, and smashed against some rocks. He was rushed to the hospital, but didn't survive. Nancy cried in my arms, and I tried to comfort her with all the love I could muster. We were sitting, talking about Matt, when Eleanor padded downstairs, barefoot and in pajamas. She threw herself on me, crying, "Daddy's dead. I haven't got a daddy anymore. I want a daddy. Can you be my daddy?" Nancy tried to calm her down, and in the end, I carried the 4-year-old up to bed. At her bedside was a cradle with a doll in it. The real baby had been born prematurely and didn't survive. It happened just after Matt's death, so they were grieving for 2 family members. When Nancy went downstairs, Eleanor whispered in my ear, "I saw that Daddy would die soon, and then I saw that you and I and Mummy would move someplace with loads of flowers." I was startled to hear this. Could I take Matt's family to Telos? That's what happened, and something else too. We took another relative with us to Telos. I rang grandmother to say I was fine and that I was planning to depart soon for the world inside the earth. Grandmother was on the verge of collapse. She'd received threats after the last meeting of her parapsychology friends. She'd mentioned me and Telos, believing her friends to be interested. Some unauthorized person had wormed their way in and was horrified at the discussion. She had received lots of hate mail, and even a death threat. She should have gone to the police, but that would take time. Could she come with Matt's widow and me? I asked Manel for advice in the usual way. Of course my grandmother was welcome in Telos, was his joyful reply. I rang grandmother and told her to pack as fast as she could and get the earliest possible flight to Seattle. It wasn't long before she was at my door with a whole truckload of luggage. The journey to Mount Shasta was tough, but we were rewarded by the sight of Manel, who met us at the hidden entrance to the Subterranean wonderland. He brought Titch with him, and I was literally bowled over by his exuberant greeting. Eleanor and Titch fell in love at once. Titch became a gleaming black comfort in all our lives. Nancy had been overjoyed when I invited her to accompany me to Wonderland. But there was a lot to organize before we left. After this visit to Sweden and Seattle, I've kept away from the outer world. What I'm going to tell you now is solely about Agartha. 8. Back underground. Look at all these flowers, was Nancy's first exclamation as we stepped out of the small trucks which had brought us from Mount Shasta. Eleanor and Titch immediately romped around on a lawn full of daisy-like flowers of pink, yellow, and white. Manel chuckled at them. It's great to see happy children, he said. I bid you all a warm welcome to our land. We'll do our best to make you happy here. My grandmother, Emily, looked around and then exclaimed, "This is nothing new. I recognize this from my dreams. It feels like I'm on the right side of Dreamworld now." Our luggage, there was quite a lot of it, had come in a separate truck from the tunnel and was being loaded into one of the vehicles which floated above the ground. Manel called one of these over and asked us to climb aboard. It was nothing new to me. Nancy and Eleanor watched in surprise as I stepped into the spacious vehicle. Manel and I were able to transport ourselves differently, but I didn't want to leave my friends and grandmother alone in a foreign country. The vehicle set off towards their new home. I call it a vehicle, as the transport in Telos is neither car, nor boat, nor airplane. We call them hovercraft, as hover is what they do. We hovered a moment and oh, look, gosh, were the only words my friends could utter. We stopped in front of a house, one of the roofless, round houses which make up the town of Telos. My grandmother clapped her hands in delight. She had greeted Manel like an old friend, and thanked him for his brilliant rescue of her beloved grandchild. I was a bit embarrassed, but at the same time proud of my beautiful, intelligent, and loving grandmother. When I had told her about Telos back home in Sweden, she did not seem at all surprised. She had already dreamed about a place inside the earth. She seemed quite at home here now. Manel gazed at my grandmother in a strange way, as if they already knew each other. I didn't ask. There would come a time when all these questions would be answered. It was always like that. Eleanor, who, by the way, was known as Ellie, was first to rush through the open door. There were no dividing walls in the round house, just as there was no roof. It was just one big circular space. There were portable screens in case a separate bedroom was needed. In the center was the great living room which you furnished in accordance with your desire. There wasn't really a kitchen, just a place near the wall where cups and plates were stacked on a shelf above an ample table with drawers. I already knew this, but naturally, it seemed strange to the two ladies. "There's no oven or sink or dishwasher," came from Nancy. I could see she was desperately trying not to laugh, yet at the same time seemed on the verge of tears. Grandmother was calm. "Nice not to cook," she said, sinking into a comfortable armchair in the central section. There were flowers in abundance, even indoors. The various areas of the room were divided with flowers. It made the house cozy and welcoming. "I need to pee, Mummy." Ellie had rushed around inspecting everything, but hadn't found the bathroom. I laughed and took her through a side door. The bathing facilities were there. There was a kind of toilet where bodily waste disappeared and dissolved ingeniously. You washed and bathed in a pool belonging to the house. As for food, you ordered it via a machine in the kitchen area, or went to the house it was served in, which I'll tell you about later. You pressed a button and then decided whether you wanted foodstuffs or a prepared meal. This involved the power of thought. There are people who work in this town, then, observed Nancy as we walked around the garden and Titch marked his favorite spots. Where do you live? Suddenly, full memory of my previous time in Telos came flooding back in. I have my own house not far from here, I replied. Everyone works, Nancy, but in a different way than you are used to. What do you do? Asked Nancy again. I'm a type of healer. I help people. There is actually a sort of hospital here, but not like those above ground. We show people how to help themselves. What if Ellie fell and broke her leg? Nancy was stubborn. Then I'd cure her pretty quickly. I smiled. Anything can be cured in our way. How come there's such a difference between the surface and inside the earth? Nancy wondered. We've got the same soil around us. But, I responded, there's a difference in age between your soil and our soil. The souls which inhabit this part of our globe are ancient. Some of yours are ancient too, but here the ancient wisdom is established. There was a yell from the garden, an unmistakable Ellie scream. We rushed out and, to my delight, saw Ellie face to face with a kangaroo, complete with a joey in its pouch. Nancy laughed. There are plenty of wild animals roaming freely here, and they are not at all dangerous, I said, as the terrified Ellie hid behind her mother. The kangaroo stayed, and I went and patted it. It was used to people and, looking at Ellie in surprise, it hopped off into the trees. People and animals are friends here, I explained to the frightened 4-year-old. You have to learn not to be scared, and to wait for the animal to come and let you pat it. Never pat wild animals on the head, but on the neck or back, and don't rush at them. Always stay calm. Animals can sense that. Titch sat by the door as if he was guarding it. He was naturally a great guard dog, but as that wasn't necessary here, I decided to keep him just as a pet. He liked grandmother, so he might spend some time with her. I went inside. Grandmother was still in the armchair, looking a bit lost. Oh, there you are, Tim, she said, smiling. Shall I find myself a corner here? No, I replied. You're going to have your own house next door to me. Let's go now, as Nancy has plenty of unpacking to do. We walked on the grass between spaciously arranged houses and soon reached my abode and the house next door where grandmother would live. She was in rapture. It was a pale pink house with silver gables, roofless, of course, with roses and climbing plants everywhere. Goodness gracious, repeated grandmother a number of times as we looked around. I'm going to love it here. I really hoped this was true. Although Telos has a friendly atmosphere, it is full of adventures too. There is wilderness outside the town, and wild animals live close by, but not with humanity as such. There are various tribes who have moved here and live their own lives. They have their own traditions, which we may find difficult to understand. The rest of us in Telos don't get involved, why should we? There is a law here giving humans the right of freedom. Freedom is more important than anything. I told grandmother this. Freedom of the soul is a good thing, she agreed. But it's difficult to experience complete freedom while in a community with fellow humans. There are different types of freedom, Tim. You have some kind of laws here, don't you? What are they? You'll see later, grandmother. I smiled. We don't need to discuss that now. But one thing you do need to know, we have the most extraordinary library imaginable, unparalleled on Earth. The books are kind of place performed for you. It's difficult to explain, you have to see it. I promise you, you won't be bored here. Taking a taxi to the library costs nothing, and is quick. Great! Grandmother said. May we start a complete tour tomorrow, so I can get acquainted with as much as possible of this part of our planet? Today I want to rest in my new home, inspect the garden, and feel that you, and Titch, of course, are close by. That's quite a comprehensive tour you're planning, I laughed. But first you have to see my house and find your way there, Because the houses aren't laid out like on the surface. Up there they are crammed together, but here they are well spaced. There's room for a garden and a vegetable patch. If you can't manage to grow food yourself, someone will help. Let's go to my house and have lunch. I've shown Nancy how to order prepared food. We'll have dinner together, too. Grandmother and I sat discussing the differences and comparing everything to life on the surface. End of section 8. If you find this audiobook useful, please subscribe to my channel, Rapid Reads.